I thought there were just a few other interesting facts that stood out to me. So the first was that the complaint from the neighbor was, oh, there'll be traffic and parking. And the whole reason why he wanted to host these prayer gatherings on the Sabbath at his house was that his Orthodox Jewish faith prohibited him from driving. So the
And
notion that
prohibited his co-religious from driving as well.
exactly. So the whole thing is designed to be a walking distance gathering. So the notion that there would be traffic concerns from 10 people walking to a house is just on its face absurd.
Too many people on the sidewalk. You can't handle that.
Yeah, not like a library though. That would be okay.
They've got the big hats, man. They get. I can't drive in the street with all these hats. Sorry,
And,
sorry, IJ, don't fire me.
The other thing that stood out to me a little bit was the sort of retaliatory acts that the city took. And so there were two.
Zoned to pray and a drone to find your prey. This week, here on Short Circuit, your podcast on the Federal Courts of Appeals. I'm your host, Anthony Sanders, director of the Center for Judicial Engagement at the Institute for Justice. We are recording this on Monday, November 17th, 2025. It will go out the day after Thanksgiving next week. So happy belated Thanksgiving to all of our viewers and listeners. I hope you had a wonderful time eating whatever prey that you happen to have around the house with your friends and family. We are going to be discussing prey that you find with a drone, and perhaps you could have at a Thanksgiving dinner table, although you won't be able to because the state of Michigan doesn't allow it. We'll get to that later on. That is a Sixth Circuit case about using a drone to help you hunt. Before that, we will be getting to another Sixth Circuit case, so a bonus Sixth Circuit this week on zoning law and the right of religious liberty, but also standing ripeness mootness that gets in the way of adjudicating religious liberty. So we'll get to those two cases a little later. The first one will be brought to you by Suranjan Sen, who has been on this show many times before, and I always love having back. But before we get to him and religious liberty and zoning, I want to introduce a first-timer here on the show, and that is Tate Cooper. So Tate has recently joined us at IJ. He is a grad of the University of Missouri, which is in Columbia, Missouri. He's also a native of Columbia, Missouri, so he's a true Missourian. And he also went to undergrad in Missouri, and he was part of this Oxbridge Scholars Program, which means he knows a little bit about Oxford and a little bit about Cambridge. But actually, it's not quite like that. But you want to explain it to us, Tate?
I would love to. William Jewell College is a fantastic liberal arts school in Liberty, Missouri. And the honors program there, the Oxbridge Honors Program, the junior year is spent either, originally it was at Oxford or Cambridge, now it's just at Oxford. I had some health issues, so I actually didn't end up going to Oxford and did other things in the U.S. here. But the whole course of study is modeled on the British model with tutorials and then comprehensive exams at the end of the 4 years.
And so I've spoken to people over the years who have been to Oxford or Cambridge, or I had a professor who told us a little bit about, like, she graduated from Cambridge, I think. And it's like you have tutorials one-on-one with your professor on your writing and your reading or whatever. They also have lectures, but most people don't go to the lectures. Maybe that's not how they did it at your college, but that's what I always say. How does that mixture work?
So I heard when they were at Oxford that the study schedule was a lot easier than what it was in Liberty. We didn't have optional lectures, so we had our tutorials weekly, and then we had occasional events throughout the semester. But then the rest of our classes were regular classes with the rest of the general curriculum.
Right. And so also you are not just that program, but you were a minor in math and music, which is a wonderful combination, I think. The ancient Greeks would be proud of you. But the math piqued my interest. So Cambridge is famous for science and math. And I was recently reading about 19th century English lawyers, like not them generally, but just like a few specific ones. And it kept coming up that they would be like trained in math at Cambridge. And so, which I don't know what the
It's
connection
maths.
between. Oh, it's
Maths,
sorry.
Anthony.
Yeah, this is an American audience, so we're not going to do that, Suranjan. But you're right, maths, as they would say, or mathematics, of course. But a surprisingly high number of them had this math background, and a couple won this award. Do you know what the award is for the best undergrad math student at Cambridge?
The Leibniz Award.
Oh, that would be controversial, right? I think it would be the Newton Award. They're not going to talk
Probably.
about Leibniz there. But no, it is called the Senior Wrangler. So if you're like the best mathematician at undergrad in Cambridge, you get this thing called the Senior Wrangler. And some of them went on to be like barristers and stuff. And at that time, I don't know if that's still like a pipeline or whatever. So I thought that was a little odd. But the other thing I wanted to ask you about, though, is you are a double clerk. So you clerk for Judge O'Scanlan on the Ninth Circuit and Judge Sykes on the Seventh Circuit. I'm not going to get into, they're both great judges. We've done many of their opinions here at IJ over the years. We've had some of their clerks on. In fact, we had a O'Scanlan Orama episode last year that we'll put a link to in the show notes. But tell us your impressions, like, clerking on the Seventh versus the Ninth Circuit. What are differences? What are similarities? Is there, certain kind of clerk is better in one than the other? What do you think?
Yeah, they're very different experience, which is funny because on the surface it seems like they should all be so similar because the job description is pretty much the same across the board. But the Ninth Circuit is so big, and oral argument is held all over. So you're flying to Pasadena, San Francisco. I didn't go to Anchorage or Honolulu, but the Honolulu sitting is a hot ticket. Portland, Seattle, so it's a massive area. There were 52 judges, including the senior judges when I was there. So just a very large circuit. The in-bank calendar is always very busy. I think the year that I left, by the time I left, I think there had been 30 in-bank votes by August. And I think Judge O'Scanlan said that was a slower year. So it's just very active. A lot of cases aren't argued. They submit a lot on the briefs. And then of the cases that do make it there, very few are published. So I think it was about 91% are handled in unpublished memorandum dispositions, which are, very short, cursory, not binding. And the Seventh Circuit is the exact opposite in a lot of regards. So it only has 3 states. It had 11 judges when I was there, plus 2 seniors, I believe. Every argument is in Chicago, except maybe a special sitting at a law school or 2. So it's very tight geographically, small. Everything's in Chicago. Every case gets argued if there's an attorney on it. So every counsel case gets argument, and over 90% of the cases get published. So it's sort of the exact opposite in a couple of those regards.
Yeah, they really are the mirror image in that way. That's
so it's
funny.
very interesting going between those two, just very different characteristics.
Right. And we had a Seventh Circuit special, as probably most listeners know, a couple of months ago. So we'll put a link to that in the show notes also. But now we're going to go to the Sixth Circuit. And appropriately, we have a former Fifth Circuit clerk to discuss this case from the Sixth Circuit. So Suranjan can give us a little bit of an outsider's perspective here. But Suranjan, so this case is about a target of ours at IJ in recent years, zoning, and how zoning intersects with something pretty darn, something you think would be outside of the zoning purview, which is having a few people over to your house to pray. But apparently zoning in some way got in the way of that, but maybe in some ways didn't. So what's the story?
Well, if you know much about zoning, which I take it a lot of our listeners probably do, then you wouldn't be too surprised that zoning would interfere into getting its clutches into every aspect of human life. But so there's this case is in this town in Ohio. where this gentleman, his last name's Grand, so Mr. Grand, is a member of an Orthodox Jewish community, and he feels that his faith compels him to not use certain technology on Saturdays. He's not able to, for example, drive anywhere, and simultaneously, his faith compels him to pray multiple times a day, and he'd like to pray in fellowship with other believers. And that made it hard for him on Saturdays to be able to attend his local, I'm sorry for my Jewish listeners, I know it's temple, synagogue, center, to pray with other people. And so he wanted to invite certain friends or neighbors to come to his house to pray on Saturdays with him. So he sent some letters around to the neighbors, inviting them to come by and pray with him on Saturdays. And one of the neighbors was a local, let's say, busybody. I was trying to think of a nice way of saying busybody.
We'll take busybody. There's always one, isn't there?
At least one, who took this invitation to come pray at his neighbor's home and forwarded it to the city mayor, saying that this guy was going to be running an unlawful house of religious worship, contrary to the city's zoning laws. So the mayor forwarded that to the city attorney, and who then sent a letter to Mr. Grand ordering him to cease and desist, saying that he was in violation of the local zoning code, which allowed only the use in the area of properties for single-family homes, for libraries, and for buildings owned by the Board of Education.
So public schools, basically.
So, I suppose so. I guess maybe public libraries or something. I have no idea, but it seemed a little odd. But anyway. And said that there could be he could get code enforcement violations against him if he didn't stop doing this. And he said that he was inviting at maximum 10 to 12 people over at one time. And I guess the neighbors' concern, the mayor's concern, et cetera, was that his activities would create a traffic hazard, parking hazard, make it difficult for fire and other emergency services, et cetera. So Grand then applied for a special use permit to use the parcel, to use his home as a house of worship, which apparently was something you can get as a conditional use permit. And while he was going through that process, some of the members of the Planning Commission expressed doubt that what he was doing actually was prohibited under the zoning law, or rather, if it actually would count as a quote unquote house of worship. In particular, given that his arguments for why the special use permit should be granted, regarding there's only a few people, they're only coming and praying with me. This isn't like a typical church or something like that. Seemed to be kind of an argument, almost why he's not really a house of worship anyway. So then, instead of continuing through that process and getting a final decision by the Planning Commission or the Zoning Board of Appeals, et cetera, Mr. Grand then decided, you know what, I think I don't fit under the house of worship. I think I can just do this on my own without a special use permit. And so he pulled his application and just dropped that process completely. And here's where things get a little bit strange, and why I think the opinion ultimately came out the way it did. He said, okay, you know what, I think that this doesn't apply to me. I think I can just do this anyway. And so he dropped his application for the special use permit, and then he filed a federal case saying that the city can't enforce this restriction against me. So it's kind of like a little bit of a weird factual pattern where, on the one hand, he stopped the process saying it doesn't apply to me, and then filed suit saying the city is unlawfully applying this to me. So the panel dismissed his as-applied claim. He raised multiple constitutional claims, some statutory claims that were all related to his is exercising speech or is exercising his religious rights. There's a couple of other claims which probably aren't worth mentioning here. And the court dismissed those as applied to him, his as-applied claims, as unripe, saying that there wasn't a final decision, that he didn't get a decision from the administrative body itself, that they were going to be enforcing this against him. The cease and desist letter didn't count. And that it was just too early to do anything about this case, and so they dismissed it without prejudice. And then they also dismissed his facial challenge, saying that he forfeited it by not really pressing it below, and that regardless, it seemed pretty clear that there are some circumstances where the government could lawfully prevent somebody from hosting a mega church in.
Right, because his facial challenge was basically requirement you have a permit for any kind of house of worship, because I mean that's what the ordinance says, right? So
I suppose
you could conjure up any, like a mega church with 5,000 people, and then it would be constitutional, require a permit then. Yeah. So that's why it wouldn't work.
Yeah, I mean, I would without having I mean, part of the reason they dismissed it is because he failed to press the argument. So I'm not sure exactly what he would have argued, but. I guess it was something like that. It seems a little strange to me that whether it's a large house of worship that would be something you could prohibit or not, I still don't understand exactly what the point is of its house of worshipness. I don't know, but I guess I would be willing to concede that there would be some houses of worship that could make sense to prohibit under zoning laws in certain areas. For reasons other than there being a house of worship. But I want to first say what I think, where it's understandable, where I think the panel makes sense, and then I of course have to criticize a little bit. And so first, where it makes sense is where I was saying earlier that it's not surprising that the panel would find this unripe, saying that you don't know if it applies to you, because his own, I mean, just the pattern of events, the factual narrative here just involves the guy himself stopping his permit application process under the stated rationale that, you know what, I think this doesn't actually apply to me anyway. And so it is kind of weird to that he then filed a federal suit saying they can't apply this to me. Though I'm not sure that it should necessarily be anything wrong with saying that this doesn't apply to me, and by the way, to the extent that they've threatened me with a cease and desist letter, they can't do that. But so I think that's understandable, and I think it also makes sense that if he didn't prove his facial challenge, then why he would fail at it. But here's a few things that I think the panel misses the mark en route to getting to its destination. The first one is that I think the panel erroneously invokes Williamson County to a place other than ad hoc Penn Central regulatory takings factors. So if senior listeners might remember, I hate Williamson County. Williamson County is this case that back in the 80s, the court basically said created these procedural hurdles that prevented people from ever getting effectively into federal court on a claim that invokes the takings clause. One of them was a state exhaustion requirement. You exhaust all of the procedures for the state's takings relief, including not only administrative procedures but also judicial procedures. And then the second prong was a so-called finality requirement, where if there's ever any opportunity that this city might modify or waive the requirement, then you have to go through that process and get a final decision as to whether or not the city or the government is going to waive or modify it.
And the justification for that second one, right, is that you don't know what the property is until you've gone through those steps, so then you know what property is being taken, right? That's the excuse. Sort
of. Well, so the justification under Williamson County for both of them really was this idea that you're never really injured. Nothing's really been applied to you unless and until like the well, for the first prong, unless the state has denied that they're going to give you money or anything or relief, and then the second prong, if there might be any avenue that it ever might not be applied to you in the future, then it's like it never ever really was applied to you to begin with, but now the stated rationale, since the first prong of Williamson County was thankfully overruled in 2019. But the second prong was left untouched. The court just said it wasn't. We've not been asked to overrule it. We're not touching it. The problem here is why there should be, if we have this doctrine of prudential ripeness, why there should be a kind of super doctrine of prudential ripeness in the land use context. What happens is that these courts take Williamson County to impose something more than ordinary prudential ripeness in the land use context. I mean, there's plenty of cases where an as-applied claim is held to be ripe, notwithstanding that the government, if asked, might waive it sometime in the future. But for some reason, it seems like there's like some hyper special reason in the land use context, or more particularly in the takings context, why possibly the government might in the future waive this should matter. I think that the only way that this really makes sense as a prudential matter is in just the Penn Central regulatory takings context, where your claim is that this is more or less, this is a fine restriction. It's just that its application against me is just because of my individual circumstances, or this particular parcel or this project's individual circumstances is a little too costly. And in that case, I can see I'm not saying I concede that this is right, but I can understand an argument that, look, the whole reason the city has this waiver, this modification, this special exception process is for precisely these situations where they can have a restriction that 99 times out of 100 is fine, and then they can't create restrictions that will, on the face of the restriction itself, take into account how costly it's going to be for every single person and every single project, every single parcel, and so when it comes to these kinds of, if they might modify it slightly this much, slightly that much, it will make me be able to eke out a profit, and that would be okay, but right now I can't eke out a profit, and that's not okay, then it could make sense as a prudential matter, I think, to have some sort of, just go through this special exception process first. That's what Williamson County itself was where a developer was being told they could only build something like 100 units, and they said, well, I'm going to make a loss if they would let me build 120 units, and that would be fine. And I mean, and it was a giant developer. It might make sense to have that sort of, just go through that first. But it doesn't make sense to me in other contexts where this isn't about, your claim is saying that this is slightly too expensive, or this is regulations going slightly, quote, too far, and we can't really know how far is too far until they've gone. I mean, if what he's saying is they've prohibited houses of worship, they can't do that. They can't stop me from doing that. It doesn't make sense to me to force somebody to go through a special exception process before they can go to court to challenge something that they're arguing the city never has the right to enforce against them in the first place. And so I hope that one day the Supreme Court will revisit the finality prong of Williamson County to either get rid of it completely and say, look, this is all just prudential ripeness. There's no reason why the takings should be the redheaded, disfavored stepchild, or at least narrow it to just Penn Central regulatory takings claims. So I think that was the first problem. They relied heavily on Williamson County and then I think something that flowed from that is that they placed the burden on the claimant to show why it would be harmful not to reach his claim. Whereas under my understanding of prudential ripeness, if we all agree that there's an Article 3 case or controversy, then the presumption should be reaching the claim, and that there should be extremely weighty prudential concerns that would justify not reaching a claim for which there is in fact the claimant with a personal stake in.
Right.
In,
I mean,
in
the whole
outcome.
point of prudential ripeness is it's prudential. It's not jurisdictional. It's the court can go there if it thinks it makes sense.
That's right. And there are justices in the court right now, Justice Thomas comes immediately to mind, who doubt the entire basis of so-called prudential ripeness. And, I'm spoiler alert, I'm inclined to agree with him, though I think at the very least it should be quite narrow. And so and I think that flowed from Williamson County, from this special thing for takings or land use claims where they flip the burden of prudential ripeness. The other issue where I think that they missed the mark was in dismissing his facial claim. They said the panel held that he forfeited his facial challenge by not pressing it below, but that can't be squared. I mean, that reasoning is immediately foreclosed by everyone's favorite case, Citizens United.
I thought you were going there.
I know that people in the popular cultural zeitgeist take Citizens United for one thing, and I don't think it actually stands for that at all. But that's neither here nor there. What I take Citizens United, the way that it applies to most of the work that I do at IJ, has nothing to do with its speech analysis. But has to do with its discussion of the nature of facial versus as-applied claims. And in Citizens United, it was pretty much seemed, if I remember correctly, about the exact same thing as what happened here, maybe even
Yeah, I think
worse, because I believe the
even worse
person
in
in Citizens United didn't
United.
even didn't say the word facial at all. This guy, at least, it seems, pleaded facial relief in his complaint. And so at Citizens United has this long discussion, several different reasons of saying, like, this is the wrong approach for courts to say that you didn't plead a facial relief and so we're not going to go there, or you didn't make an argument that was labeled facial relief so we're going to go there, that this isn't about magic words, that in almost all cases of what a facial challenge means versus as applied challenge is not about a different claim per se, but about whether the reasoning underlying the challenge or the court's decision hinges on a defect of the restriction that's being challenged, or whether it hinges on circumstances that are particular to the claimant.
And it goes to the remedy, right? They explicitly say that. It goes to the remedy, not to the argument.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a little bit perhaps in doubt post causa, the decision, but without getting into whether it's, they do say that. I'm not sure that that's actually correct really anymore. But I would say that the distinction goes toward whether the reasoning of the argument presented or the reasoning that the court adopts is the kind of reasoning that would doom the restrictions enforcement period. Whether it's something that's inherent, it's something that you can see, a restriction that is apparent from the face of the ordinance that's being challenged. And so if somebody is arguing that you can't distinguish between people based on whether they're worshiping or not, then I would think that would be a kind of facial challenge here in all circumstances. And so it doesn't really matter here because the court, the alternative reaches his merits anyway, saying he didn't prove it. Which I guess if you didn't press the argument, that's one way of making it likely that that the court's going to find that you didn't prove the argument you didn't press. But I think that I worry that there's going to be some mischief that's going to come from this notion that we can't entertain a facial challenge because you didn't say the magic word facial. And one last thing that I would say to kind of wrap that up to harken back to earlier their as applied analysis, the very fact that he had his facial challenge would have been ripe, demonstrates ipso facto, or should demonstrate, that his as-applied, that any hurdle prudentially to his as-applied challenge would be prudential and not jurisdictional. Because these aren't separate claims here. It's not saying, you're not saying that I was injured in a sense when this ordinance was passed, and then separately I'm injured through its enforcement. I mean, these are just, to the extent there's as-applied versus facial challenge, it's saying I'm being injured by the enforcement. The city has a policy and practice of, in Monell terms, of enforcing this thing. I know that it has a policy and practice of enforcing this thing because it's written it down in its ordinance, and it's sent me a letter saying I better stop or it's going to enforce it against me. And so the very fact that that it should be a clue to people that we should be just an ordinary in the realm of ordinary prudential ripeness here. The reason why it's ipso facto prudentially ripe when you have a facial challenge is because it can't depend on facts that need to be developed. You're saying that this can never be enforced against anybody. But it mystifies me. This is a question that's still somewhat in the ether of to what extent that Williamson County's finality requirement is jurisdictional versus prudential. I think that alone means that it can't be anything but prudential. And so I think ultimately the panel, I understand why they ruled the way they did, and I'm not necessarily pushing back on whether or not this guy ultimately has a successful claim. But I do have my concerns with the way they went about this, and I'm going to keep riding the hobby horse that clarifying exactly what Williamson County is or is not, and clarifying what exactly a facial challenge is or is not, particularly in when it comes to property restrictions, is something that the Supreme Court sorely needs to address.
Well, that is almost the unanswered question, ultimate unanswered question of constitutional law. If you're a public interest litigator, at least, is the whole facial versus as applied thing. Tate, do you have any special concerns about this case?
Well, I thought there were just a few other interesting facts that stood out to me. So the first was that the complaint from the neighbor was, there will be traffic and parking, and the whole reason why he wanted to host these prayer gatherings on the Sabbath at his house was that his Orthodox Jewish faith prohibited him from driving. So and
prohibited his co-religionists from driving as well.
Exactly. So the whole thing is designed to be a walking distance gathering. So the notion that there would be traffic concerns from 10 people walking to a house is just on its face absurd.
Too many people on the sidewalk. You can't handle that.
Yeah, not like a library though. That would be okay.
They've got the big hats, man. I can't drive in the street with all these hats. Sorry, IJ, don't fire me.
The other thing that stood out to me a little bit was the sort of retaliatory acts that the city took. And so there were two. The first was that the police lieutenant instructed officers to patrol past the Grand House, specifically to look for zoning violations. And that never really came up in the Sixth Circuit opinion, so I don't know if it just wasn't pressed or what. The other was the housing inspection. They had a housing inspector come by, and Grand's wife consented to allowing him to come in and search. Nothing came of it, so presumably he found no zoning violations. And the opinion did address that and said, well, you consented to the search, so there's no Fourth Amendment violation. But it never addressed, again, after the facts, the sort of increased police attention to be looking out, which I just thought was sort of another interesting facet of this case.
There's one random statement, right, that I think it's just a neighbor alleged that one time he had 120 people over.
I don't think that was him. I think it was another person.
Another person had their own house.
I don't think it was the neighbor. I think it was the mayor who, when Mr. Grand told him, look, there's only going to be like 10 to 12 people, that Mr. Grand was skeptical, in part because apparently somebody else had over like 100 people.
Yeah, it's a little attenuated. Yeah, I think this case just goes to how zoning can get into the most just smallest parts of our lives because of how zoning laws are written. Like, I think if he really was having 10 people walk to his house regularly, like every Saturday, and they would pray, and this actually went to court, any court, state or federal, is going to go bend over backwards to read the ordinance to not cover that, because of course, that is starting to get insane. Like, I mean, whether it covers a prayer group or whether it covers a birthday party or something like that, a court doesn't want to say that the town can actually ban that, and the town itself is not going to want to, when pressed, actually ban that. But the fact that he has to go through all this stuff to get to there points that there's a huge problem. I mean, maybe some insane zoning code enforcement person would actually enforce it in that way. The other thing that I have, so Suranjan, you were talking about Williamson County, which is that it's all interesting about whether how the second step of Williamson County still works, but like at the end of the day too, this is a free exercise case, not a takings case. So why is Williamson County in it at all?
Well, that's what I was saying is that I would say, to the extent the Williamson County finality requirement makes sense at all, it should be limited to a Penn Central ad hoc claims where you're just saying that this fails because of my specific investment backed expectations, something the city, it's hard for government to really take into account, and this is why we have these waiver provisions to sort of like take the edge off these things. I would say that it shouldn't apply to other kinds of claims that relate to the takings clause, and it certainly shouldn't apply to claims that are have nothing to do with the takings clause. This guy did not raise a takings claim, as again, I think it's under this sort of legal fiction that it's not really affecting you, until you've gone through everything, saying that we're not going to waive it, which again doesn't make sense, because then by that notion, you shouldn't have an Article 3 case or controversy for your facial challenge either. It's like, is this affecting me or not? I think it really is just an outgrowth, I think, at the bottom of this sort of courts trying to find a reason why they should bend over backwards to defer to zoning land use boards, and it's very frustrating. I mean, frankly, I don't see how. So in 2019, the court overruled or abrogated the first prong of Williamson County, which was the exhaustion requirement. But I think that this case demonstrates how the finality requirement is still being used effectively as an exhaustion requirement. Section 1983 is well settled, or supposed to be well settled, that it has no exhaustion requirement. This under the it feels like a lot of willful blindness, like when it's, we don't. Let me give you an example of where I think this would make lots of sense. Sorry, I really hate this issue, or love this issue, depending on how you want to. Where this would make sense, I think, would be if, let's say, the presumption is that you can do the thing, that you apply for the permit and then you'll get it, and then there's some provision that says when the administrator thinks that this is going to have a negative impact on the public streets, then the administrator can demand that you give money to expand the streets. Then it would make sense to me to say, look, the presumption is that it's not going to be applied to you. Like, the presumption is that you go through this permit process, you'll get it. Like, it would be an advisory opinion to say that he can't do this if there's too many things that can happen between now and then. You need to go through this, apply for the permit, and then maybe he'll say, I mean, chances are he's just going to say, great, here's your permit. It doesn't make sense to me where the baseline is that the property is restricted and you have to apply for a waiver or a modification. Like, my property is being restricted by this prohibition or condition right now. If I'm arguing that they cannot constitutionally enforce that against me, it feels perverse to me to tell me, well, go ask nicely, get down on your hands and knees and beg and kiss the ring, and then maybe, maybe they'll, in all their infinite graces, decide to waive this restriction that you were saying they can't enforce against you lawfully anyway. I just, the whole thing's incoherent, and I think, quite frankly, it's. I don't mean this against these judges in this panel. Personally, I like these judges, but just as a broader doctrine writ large, I think it reflects a kind of judicial cowardice, frankly.
Well, we're going to get to more incoherence for those who love incoherence in the law. And that's also a Sixth Circuit case, which, as I said earlier, has to do with drones. So it's not something I'm super familiar with. It has to do with drones and hunting. But Tate is going to tell us this tale: drones, hunting, and free speech.
That classic combo. Right. This case comes out of Michigan. There's a plaintiff, Mike Yoder. He owns a business, Drone Deer Recovery. And so what this business does is when hunters are out hunting, shoot a deer, a lot of times, it doesn't fall right where you shoot it. So you have to track it, find the deer, take it out. And what Drone Deer Recovery does is it offers a service where it connects hunters with drone operators in their area. So when a deer is shot but doesn't go down and the hunter can't find it immediately, they can contract with one of these drone operators to go look for the deer. They'll use infrared imaging. Once they find the heat signature that they think is the injured or downed deer, they'll turn on lights and cameras, confirm that it's the deer, get a GPS coordinate, and then send that to the hunter so the hunter can go retrieve the deer. It seems like a very sensible service that provides a useful service to hunters who are trying to find their deer. But Michigan doesn't allow it under a state statute, the drone statute, that says you can't use any unmanned vehicle or unmanned device that uses aerodynamic forces to achieve flight to hunt or to take game. And then the definition of taking game is very broad. And so that means to hunt, kill, chase, follow, harass, pursue, or collect animals. And so
this applies on any land, right? Like private land, public land, wherever you are.
Right. Much like most of the fishing game laws apply equally, because the idea behind them is that the game is a resource of the state. And so the state can regulate it even if it's not on public land. And so Yoder and Drone Deer Recovery would like to operate in Michigan. They say that they have people who would like to hire them, and in fact, one of the plaintiffs is someone who would like to hire an operator through Drone Deer Recovery who's unable to because of the statute. And Michigan Department of Natural Resources enforces this statute, and they release public guidance saying that using a drone in this way to try and find a downed deer to direct the hunter to it violates the statute because it's taking game under the terms of the statute, so it can't be done. And so Yoder, his company, and this Michigan resident who would like to use a drone operator in this way sue the Department of Natural Resources for a violation of the First Amendment in federal court in Michigan. And the district court initially dismisses the case. It held both that the plaintiffs lacked standing and that the case failed on the merits. And so the district court really separated the drone operation into two buckets. And so the first bucket, it said, is just flying the drone looking for the deer, and that has no speech component. So that's pure conduct, there's no speech. The second component is where the speech comes in, and that's the drone operator sharing the GPS coordinates with the hunter. And so the district court said, well, those are completely separate, so regulating the one has no First Amendment implications because it's just conduct. And there's no standing because A, there's no injury to speech through regulating just the conduct, and B, the injunction that the plaintiff sought in its terms discussed, limitations on gathering the location information about the deer and sharing it. And so the district court said, well, there's no redressability if we grant that injunction because it has nothing to say about the first part, just flying the drone. So the plaintiffs appeal that to the Sixth Circuit, and the Sixth Circuit affirms the judgment, but on different grounds. So it rejects the district court's standing analysis. And here, it's a pre-enforcement challenge. So where the court really zooms in, you have the Lujan inquiry, so you have to show injury, traceability, redressability. And the focus here is really on injury. So as we know, you have to have an injury in fact that's concrete or particularized and actual, or concrete and particularized and actual or imminent. And so the concern in a pre-enforcement challenge is this injury imminent? Can you show that you were likely to be harmed by it because you haven't actually had anything enforced against you? And so there's 4 elements that you have to show for that. The first is the intent to engage in conduct. The plaintiffs here alleged for Yoder and drone deer recovery that they would operate in Michigan but for this statute. You have to show that it's arguably tied up with a constitutional interest, and the court said yes, they've done that because sharing that location information about the deer is speech. On the circuit court,
and that's not like the merits. That's just I allege First Amendment. That gets you the standing. It's not confused with like whether you actually win.
Right, exactly. But it does come back, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, because here the Sixth Circuit says you can't differentiate the information gathering by flying the drone from sharing that information later, that essentially put together its speech. You can't differentiate it into, like, I see this.
Right. It's like me reading a book and then talking about the book. They're kind of related.
Exactly. This will come up later when we talk about the speech inputs doctrine. But so this is where the Sixth Circuit departs from the district court and says, no, you can't separate these. You have to look at them all together. And so, yes, the plaintiffs have alleged something that's arguably tied up with the constitutional interest. The third, is it prohibited by statute? Yes. The Michigan DNR said so itself. The way you read the statute, take is very broad. It clearly falls within it. And then the fourth one is where there's some disagreement. This is whether there's a credible threat of prosecution. And so in the Sixth Circuit, you have to show subjective chill, which the plaintiffs did. They said, but for our fear of prosecution, we would be doing this. And then there's 4 factors from a case in the Sixth Circuit called McKay. And so that deals with a history of past enforcement, any enforcement warning letters directed to the plaintiff specifically, attributes of the statute that make enforcement more likely, like a citizen suit provision, or if DNR has disavowed enforcement. And so the majority looks at these and says, on balance, we weigh all of these. Yes, especially the guidance letter seems to be doing a lot of work here that it would be enforced. And DNR in the litigation refused to disavow enforcement. So weighing all those together, the court said it's a close issue, but you've shown an injury in fact, and so you can proceed on this pre-enforcement challenge. So then we get into the merits, and the first question is what level of scrutiny applies. And the plaintiffs think that this should be under strict scrutiny because it's a content-based restriction. What the Sixth Circuit says is no, this is content neutral because it doesn't depend on the message conveyed or the information created. That all it says is you can't follow game with a drone. We don't care why you're doing it. Part of what the court talks about is that in the legislative history, the Michigan legislature had 2 aims that it talked about. The first was we don't want hunters harassed by groups like PETA or other people opposed to hunting who might use drones in a way to interfere with hunters. And the second is that they wanted to preserve principles of fair chase, basically keep it, sporting, that you don't have an unfair advantage of, aerially tracking deer or other game to then shoot them down. And so the court says, look, they don't really care about why you're using the drone, so it's content neutral. Then the next thing the court says is that, and this is where the respectful from Judge Bush, which we'll talk about in a little bit, comes in. The majority says these aren't speech inputs. And so the speech input doctrine says that you can regulate certain things that aren't speech themselves. Well, First Amendment scrutiny applies to regulations of things that aren't speech themselves but are used to create speech. So a great example would be paper and ink, a printing press, things like that, that it has nothing to do with the actual content, but it would chill First Amendment expression by prohibiting gathering the information that you need or somehow expressing it using a medium. And the majority, in a very short 2-paragraph analysis, says, well, the case in the Sixth Circuit that discussed this, Liechtenstein, said only talked about cases that relied on traditional political speech. I don't think that's quite right. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But so they say, well, this isn't political speech, right? You're talking about where an injured or dead deer is. That's not political speech. So the speech inputs doctrine has nothing to say. And then finally, the majority said flying a drone isn't inherently expressive. You're not expressing any message that would be, understood by a viewer who sees you following the deer with the drone. So because it's content neutral, the speech inputs doctrine doesn't apply, and there's no expression in the flying of the drone itself. We're in intermediate scrutiny land. So there's no strict scrutiny. So instead we apply intermediate scrutiny. And there the court says that Michigan has authority under its own constitution to enact the drone statute to regulate game. It furthers important conservation efforts by preserving those fair chase principles and preventing harassment like we talked about. It's not related to the suppression of free expression. Any effect on sharing that information in the majority's view is incidental because the regulation has to do with this game, and then it's just an incidental effect on the location expression that the operators want to engage in. And then finally, it finds that the restriction isn't overly burdensome, basically because it helps further Michigan's interest in managing its game and the hunting of the game. That's a little bit interesting to me because you could easily just draw out this exception and say, except for finding, because that doesn't harm the interest that Michigan has identified at all. But perhaps because we're in intermediate scrutiny, the court doesn't want to take that fine of an analysis to the statute. So it says, well, it's good enough for intermediate scrutiny.
Right. There's no, it's not like there's a factual record how many deer get away after being shot and how many, it's just kind of hand wavy here.
Right, partially because they're at the motion to dismiss stage. So you wouldn't expect to have those facts because they haven't been developed. There's been no discovery, no summary judgment. So all we're going on right now is the complaint and the allegations. It's somewhat interesting, too. I think you can ask how related is preventing this type of drone usage? How closely does that tie into the state's actual interest? Because it's not harassing hunters and it's not harming the state's interest in game. If anything, it's somewhat serving the state's interest because it's making sure that there's no waste of, deer that have been shot. I think the state has an interest in not having this waste of, its natural resources, that if they're shot, they're harvested, used, going to feed people, etc. So it is sort of an interesting case where I don't know how well the application in this particular instance actually serves the state's legitimate interests behind the drone statute.
Yeah, I wonder, I'm not a hunter, but I have plenty of friends who are hunters. And so if an animal, whether it's a deer or a bird or whatever, the animal is shot and then you track it and you and your dogs or whatever just can't find it, that is the scenario that this drone is trying to mitigate against. And so what is it better for the state if some of those carcasses are never found and the animals get away? Because most of these animals eventually die because they've been shot. Or is it worse for the state? Is it just, the idea of fairer hunting because it's harder for the hunters? And obviously you can have restriction on hunting. Otherwise, the hunting laws themselves would be in jeopardy. So it's hard to tell what they're actually going for.
Right. And the interesting thing, too, is that the state doesn't seem to have made the argument that, preventing, we have some interest in hunters not discovering the deer that they've shot. That never comes in. That's always the upstream. We don't want an unfair competitive edge in hunting, need to protect sources. And then the harassment side of it, too, which obviously is not involved in this particular application. If you really want to
make it more sporting, you could ban all kinds of sights and stuff and rifles. I mean, maybe they have, but I don't know that much about that stuff. But it seems to me, there's some pretty state-of-the-art stuff these days for getting your deer.
Exactly. So somewhat interesting on that ground. We have a judge who concurred in the judgment. Judge Mathis disagreed on the standing analysis. He thought that they hadn't alleged enough to bring a pre-enforcement challenge. I disagree with Judge Mathis, respectfully. I think it's very tough. So in this case, you have a statute that clearly applies to what they want to do. The DNR has issued public guidance saying you can't do this under the statute. It is a crime to do what you want to do. you
And
have
there's
letters.
no special use permit like Suranjan's case.
Yeah, no Williamson County angle to bring in here. There also were letters sent to other drone operators who wanted to do this, telling them they couldn't do it. And so Judge Mathis reads the McKay factors and says, well, the warning wasn't directed to you specifically, and you have no history of past enforcement. I think that's reading a case like a statute, which we're told not to do. I also think it would set a really high standard, and it makes it a little bit odd where the more effective a law is because people are following it, the less you're able to challenge it because there would be no enforcement. And it also, the rationale underlying some of the pre-enforcement limitations, I think, is somewhat at odds with principles of criminal justice and fair notice. The idea is that you know what the law is, and you know that it will be enforced if you violate it, in theory. And it's a bit odd to say, well, you're following the law, but you don't actually know that they would follow the law and enforce it against you, so there's no case. It's an interesting hurdle toward justiciability that I don't necessarily think always makes sense. And I think the majority had the better reading of it here. What gets interesting is then the follow-up to this. So there's a petition for rehearing in bank, and Judge Bush writes a statement. So he doesn't dissent from the denial of rehearing in bank, but he raises the issue of the speech inputs doctrine, which, as we noted, got very short discussion in the majority opinion. And he says that he's concerned about how the opinion applied it, but also he thinks that the Supreme Court doctrine is a mess and the Supreme Court needs to clean it up. And that's why he says this isn't a good vehicle for in-bank consideration, because the Sixth Circuit can't clean up the Supreme Court's mess. Only the court can do that. And so his specific concern, there's this case from the Supreme Court called Sorrell versus IMS Health. And that case dealt with a Vermont statute that prohibited pharmacies, health insurance plans from sharing information about specific prescribers. So the habits of particular doctors. That data was very valuable for pharmaceutical companies to advertise those doctors through people called detailers, who would go and visit one-on-one with doctors, and they could sort of tailor their presentation and provide more helpful information based on what they knew about doctors and how they were prescribing. And what the court said was somewhat unclear. It held that that restriction violated the First Amendment. It said that heightened scrutiny applies. Then it seemed to apply a form of intermediate scrutiny because it said it was content-based. It also applied Central Hudson's analysis to commercial speech. So it's very unclear what Sorrell stands for. Judge Bush has this great line where it says, Sorrell appears to call for O'Brien intermediate scrutiny, strict scrutiny, and Central Hudson scrutiny all at the same time. So it's tough to know what to do with that. But one of the points that Judge Bush makes is that the majority restricted the speech inputs doctrine that Sorrell discusses, and it said, well, this only applies to political speech. But Sorrell itself was not political speech at all. It was how doctors are prescribing certain medication. So that distinction really doesn't seem to stand. And part of what Judge Bush notes is that if it's only political speech, that raises real concerns about how the speech inputs doctrine could be applied in journalistic cases where you might not have political speech, you're just trying to gather facts, and also in sort of the academic or research context where, again, you're trying to gather information, and you could have restrictions on how you gather that information that have nothing to do with politics, but very much restrict how you express your beliefs or views on that information.
Right. Yeah. Sorrell is or however you say it, Sorrell is one of these classic Justice Kennedy opinions where you like a lot of us at IJ will like the bottom line of what the court says, but Justice Kennedy just had this way of getting there, and there's a little bit of hand waving going on. Citizen United, to bring up what we were talking about earlier, similar at parts of that opinion, and so sorting it out is left to future courts, and so maybe this will be a vehicle. This is litigated by our friends at the Pacific Legal Foundation, so I assume they'll be taking this up, and who knows, perhaps this will be a way of clearing that up. Suranjan, it kind of does have remarkable similarity with your case in terms of, the standing went the other way than how the ripeness went in your case. What are your thoughts?
Well, I don't think anyone's going to be surprised. I also think that the argument that these people lack standing didn't make much sense to me. It can't be right. The judge, I can't remember which judge it was that concurred, saying that he thinks they don't have standing. When you like Tate was saying, when the law on its face says that this is unlawful, when the agency has issued public guidance saying this is unlawful, when the agency has told people that this is unlawful, and then I have to. What do I need to show? I guess I don't have standing to bring any challenge against this until they're literally enforcing it against me, at which point it'll be the court will then exercise younger abstention. I think it's like Tate was saying. It's if that's the standard for a pre-enforcement challenge, then let's cut this legal fiction and let's just say there's no such thing as a pre-enforcement challenge anymore. Though of course I don't want to do that. So I'm pleased that the panel did find that these people had standing. I think Judge Bush's statement respecting the denial of en banc makes sense to me. Sorrell is certainly not a model of clarity in exactly what kind of scrutiny, how exactly courts are supposed to. It's a good case, I think, but exactly what you're supposed to do with it has there's been a reckoning to from that for quite a long time, and particularly in the commercial speech, so-called commercial or occupational speech area, the courts and the Supreme Court has seemed to not really want to be reluctant to kind of actually take this to its logical conclusions. And I think that he has a lot of merit in suggesting that this might well be a speech input type case. And I think that the clue there is the prohibition on following an animal. So when I first saw this case, it was a case where the plaintiff is named Yoder, and so I thought, is this the Amish again? And then I saw it's about drones, and I said, well, that doesn't seem very Amish.
Yeah, it's like the anti-Amish Yoder.
And then I saw it was drones and hunting, and I thought that maybe people were like the Terminator, like using drones to like drone striking deer, but when I saw what the case is actually about, it seems like once you've prohibited the actual using the drones to shoot or to assist with shooting, or at least to do the hunting itself, when you're prohibiting following the animal, it seems like, I'm somewhat struggling to see what a person who's following the animal to drone would be doing for any purpose other than to transmit information about the animal's whereabouts, or to record, to look at the animal. Even the PETA harassment thing, it's like, okay, but wouldn't their point of going around be to like speak to some? It seems like you'd need something a little bit more, like for the purposes of something else, and so I found that it made sense to me that this makes whatever regulations on drones might necessarily come into play here when you're prohibiting specifically. I don't understand why then under this rule you couldn't just prohibit following somebody for any length of time, even a short period of time, to record them. Does an animal do hunters have more rights against being harassed than just ordinary folks about their day? And so I like Judge Bush says that this would pretty easily extend to other circumstances where people are following somebody around to record them, and we wouldn't accept that because there's some line whereby following somebody around could transform into harassment, that therefore the government can ban it, you following them around for like a minute on the sidewalk. And so I think that all makes sense. I do hope the Supreme Court takes this or a case like it to especially for all the reasons Judge Bush says. And my last thought was, I feel like intermediate scrutiny with the First Amendment is another one of those things where the courts never are doing what they actually say they're doing. In that Tate somewhat mentioned this, even accepting that intermediate scrutiny applies, because this isn't a case where the court said, "Oh, doesn't implicate the First Amendment at all. Get out of here, rational basis." Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not the First Amendment scholar here, but the standard is that it's serving a legitimate governmental interest, and that it is no more burdensome than necessary on the incidental speech to achieve that governmental interest. Right? That's right. Right? I'm talking about the second thing, the second prong.
Part of what's funny about this case is they repeat that standard, and I'm on page 16 of the opinion here, I think. And so no greater than is essential to the furtherance of the interest is the scope. But then when they apply it, they say it restricts expression no more than necessary. It is sufficiently narrowly tailored when an adequate relationship exists between the means and the ends. And then, paraphrasing, the statute need only further the government's interest. And that second to third sentence seems to be changing the content a bit from has to be necessary, adequate relationship, and then as long as it furthers the interest. It almost seems like we smuggled rational basis in.
Yeah, like a real and substantial standard or a reasonably related standard seems to be quite different. I would think is quite different from the government having to show that it's no more burdensome than is necessary to achieve the governmental interest.
And even there would further the interest, right? Rational basis is you can conceive that it might further the interest. Further the interest seems to me that, okay, we're going to look at the facts and see if it actually furthers the interest. And that kind of sounds like an intermediate, one of these various intermediate scrutinies. It sounds like you could do that. But again, like I said earlier, then you need to look at the facts, and beyond some really general stuff at this motion to dismiss stage, they don't do that. They could have easily remanded and said, okay, well, how does this actually operate, right? What is typical when the game are shot?
They might not have done that because I think now I don't know. Please, our friends at PLF can correct me if I'm wrong. I'm just getting this based on the opinions. It seems like maybe the PLF didn't argue for the intermediate scrutiny, like they put their eggs in the basket of this speech input doctrine. So maybe
I think they argued.
Did they? Okay.
Did they, on the alternative, there was an intermediate.
Maybe they did.
Argument?
Maybe they did. I'm judging by Judge Bush's over here.
I think so. And
maybe
certainly, I mean, the opinion, the first argument was that it was content based. So that argument was out there too to get out of.
But to your point, though, Anthony,
even if they didn't argue it, right? They're supposed to. The court at that point is supposed to engage with that.
You think but to your point, though, Anthony, I mean, even accepting that there is a legitimate governmental interest here, and even accepting that this is furthering that okay, let's accept there's a governmental interest legitimate in preventing drone usage for these hunting-related activities, and then let's accept that just preventing it outright is banning drone use over hunting grounds or whatever is furthering that interest. It doesn't then necessarily follow that is burdening this incidental speech no more than is necessary to achieve that interest. And it seems to me like the opinion didn't really engage with that at all. And it seems to be, I've again, without being a First Amendment scholar, that seems to be a pattern I've recognized that nobody actually seems to really take seriously this notion that it's supposed to do more than just furthering the interest.
It certainly is. I mean, you do see cases like, say, Central Hudson, we mentioned earlier, the commercial speech standard. Some courts do take that seriously, and then you'll have some facts, but you get a little more wiggle room, like you would on strict scrutiny, and the courts go into it. But sometimes you get these standards, and it is a little bit more rational basis-y. But those are issues that we leave for another episode. For now, I'd like to thank my colleagues for coming on and doing this little bit of a First Amendment dive in the Sixth Circuit. We will have more colleagues in future episodes. But for now, please be sure to follow Short Circuit on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all other podcast platforms. And remember to get engaged.